Central Christian Church. It's good to see everyone out this morning. It's glad you chose to worship with us this morning. I'll start off with a few announcements today. There will be a prayer circle immediately following worship today here in the sanctuary, in the back of the sanctuary. So if you'd like to participate with that, please stick around and join us. The Finance Committee has an announcement that Pledge Sundays will be Sunday, November 14th, and the following Sunday, November 21st. Letters with commitment cards were mailed out to all of you for whom we had addresses. And if you didn't get a mailing, there are commitment cards on the back table in the sanctuary. Should you wish to make a commitment financially to support the church, the Finance Committee thanks you for your support in that. Jeff's given me the 2021 nominating committee list. Those members are Karen Snyder, Pam Thorne, Willa Van Gelder, Krista Sokol, and Sharon Kisner. And if you have any suggestions for nominations, you can get in touch with any of those members. I believe Linda has a few announcements.
Next Sunday is the Fall Dessert Social right after worship in the gym. Everyone is invited. We're just going to have a yummy dessert, and we're going to do a short getting to know you activity and just visit for a few minutes. If you have signed up to bring a dessert, please remember to bring that next Sunday. And if you don't want to walk down the long flight of stairs to get to the gym, you're more than welcome to get in your car and drive around to the lower parking lot, and you can go in the double gym doors there, and then there's no steps involved at all. And then on Saturday, November 20th, we're having our women's retreat here. This is the first time we've done this here for our congregational ladies. And if you, hopefully every lady got an announcement. If you did not, an invitation. If you did not, please see me after worship and I will give you one. I have a few extras here. And if you're going to be able to attend, please let me know, because we need to know how much food to buy for lunch. It's going to be a fun day. There'll be a lot of little classes and fun stuff. And all our ladies in the congregation, everyone participating, doing the classes, are all our church ladies. So it'll just be a fun day to visit and get to know each other and have a little fun. So I really hope you come. If you have any questions about it, please ask me. Thank you.
Let us stand as we call ourselves into our time of worship, as we bring ourselves into the presence of God, who is always present for us. It is All Saints' Day, and so today we gather to celebrate the lives of our saints. We celebrate those who've passed on, but we also celebrate those who are living among us. Some have touched us personally, and others have called into question some things in our world that are ungodly, maybe not Christian, some of them legal, some of them illegal. But these gutsy saints in our lives also. But all of these saints shape who we are today. I'm reading from Revelation 21, 1 through 6. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life." Let's open our hymnals. We'll be singing hymn 611. The words and the hymn numbers are always on the screen, and some don't know that, so I want to let you know. Faithful Redeemer, the creator of all things, you promise to wipe away every tear, that death and mourning will be no more in the life hereafter, but also among the living. May we make room for your Spirit to dwell among us and make us better people of faith. Amen. You may be seated.
Our scripture reading this morning is from the book of the book of Ruth, chapter 3, verse 16 through chapter 4, verse 8. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" She told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.' Then Naomi said, 'Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today.' Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there, just as the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, 'Come over here, my friend, and sit down.' So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, 'Sit here.' And they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, 'Naomi has come back from Moab and is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so that I will know. For no one has the right to do so except you, and I am next in line.' 'I will redeem it,' he said. Then Boaz said, 'On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead on the property.' At this, the kinsman redeemer said, 'Then I cannot redeem it, because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it.' Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption of the transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, 'Buy it yourself.' And he removed his sandal. the word of God for the people of God.
Kind of a confusing passage here, but hopefully we'll figure it out as we go. For a review, for those who haven't been here the last few weeks, and also for those of us whose brains don't quite retain like it used to, we're talking about the book of Ruth. We're talking about women in a really tough society. Now, there's two ways that we can interpret this book for these women, and we'll talk about those ways of looking at this book as we go along. But it's talking about Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. Their husbands died, and so they're left in a very vulnerable, very precarious situation. In the ancient world, if a woman did not have a man, women were property. If you didn't have a man, it pretty much meant death. Could glean in the fields maybe and get a little bit to eat, but that was in the Jewish, well at the time Hebrew people's area, and these women were in Moab, and we don't know what the laws were in Moab. We don't know how hard it would have been for them, but I would imagine pretty tough. So the one daughter-in-law, Orpah, decided she would go back to her family of origin. Well, we don't know why. Now, a lot of times we've thought, well, she kind of rejected Naomi when you compare her with Ruth, who went with Naomi, but maybe not. It could have been that she was going back to a family that would bring her in and possibly had some other husband in mind that she might go and marry and go into the care of, and it might have been the best thing for Orpah. But then we have Ruth, and we wonder, well, we always say, well, she was so loyal to Naomi. She went with Naomi to the new land, and she worked, and everything was wonderful, and yes, she did, but it might have been survival for Ruth also, because Ruth maybe couldn't go back to her home of origin. After all, she'd been in an interfaith, interracial marriage, and not only that, but the Moabites and the Hebrew people were enemies. Might not have been so easy to go back to her family of origin. Now we think, well, she was sold. The father probably gave a huge amount of money, and so she was given a huge amount of money, and there was an exchange for the women to go. But maybe the father still, she was gone. She was sold, she was off, and so he didn't want her back into the household. We don't know. We really don't know. But we read in Ruth, we read these words from Ruth, and it says, and Naomi is telling Ruth, go back to your father's house. Go back and make a life for yourself. And Ruth says, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so with me, and more so, if even death parts me from you. Very beautiful words that have been used in weddings, that are words that we think are loyal, this loyalness of Ruth to Naomi. But like I said, it could have been survival. And we look at these two interpretations, both very valid, because we don't know. All we're given is facts in here. We really don't know. But we can look at it as through rose-colored eyes and, oh, what a beautiful thing that she did. Or we can look at what I say is a little more real, maybe, a little more raw, ragged, not easy to think about. And the reason that I come down with that interpretation is because in verse 18, it says, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. They didn't talk. Now, in some translations it says she didn't urge her to go back. And another one says she didn't talk to her about it anymore. But in the Hebrew, she stopped speaking to her. When you look at the meaning of the word, she just quit speaking to her. So the women went on their journey. They end up in Bethlehem. And it's kind of a visual of this burden, in my mind, that Naomi is carrying with her back to Bethlehem. Because you see, when she gets to Bethlehem, where she is from, she has to admit that her sons went into an interfaith, interracial marriage. Not only that, but they went into an interracial marriage with a land, people that were enemies. Now they went initially there, Ruth and Elimelech, because there was famine in the land in Bethlehem, which is interesting because in the Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread. But the house of bread did not have bread, and so they went to Moab. They lived for 10 years. Things were fine, but then Moab had famine, and so she's going back to Bethlehem. Survival. Dragging burdens with us. It kind of comes and goes in life, I think. Sometimes we do feel like we're dragging a burden along. Sometimes can't sleep because of this burden we're dragging along. Sometimes we survive. Sometimes it's tougher on some than others, but a visual of this. Well, they get to Bethlehem, and Ruth decides to go out into the fields because there we do know from the early law that they could glean in the fields. And the Hebrew people, God's law said that they had to let the poor glean in the fields. That is, get what was left over from the harvesters so that they had something to live on. It was the only way that they could survive. Well, Ruth ends up in the field of Boaz. And he's good to Ruth. We look at some instances that make us feel like he was probably a good man. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent, rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So we know, and we talked about this last week, that he had the ability or the power to help these women. And we find out that they're related, which gives him a little more power and ability to help these two women. But we also find out that he goes into his fields and he addresses the workers. And he said, the Lord be with you. I don't know, but I would imagine in those days with a big, stark difference between the rich and the poor, that might have been unusual for a man to go in the field and address the workers out in the field. But kind of gives us a feeling that Boaz might be a man of good character. Well, he spots Ruth, this immigrant that is in his field, and asks about her. And then he protects her. He told the men, leave her alone. You can imagine a single woman out in the fields might be kind of dangerous in those days. But he said, you stay with my female workers. And then he told the young men, leave her alone. But then not only that, he invited her to come in to eat with them. And he said, you can go to the young men, you can ask them for water. And you can get water from them. And so we have this story. We can look at it as kind of a Cinderella story. The poor maiden who is struggling through life in this wonderful Boaz coming in on his white steed and saving Ruth from what was pretty tough survival. Or we can look at it as a story of poverty, a story of desperation, a story of survival. Now, the in-between verses, between last week and this week, that we did not read, we can look at it in the Cinderella way, or we can look at it in what I say is maybe a little more honest way, but I will tell you, it is X-rated, but we'll talk about it. In verses 31 through 5, Naomi, her mother-in-law, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you." That security, that survival, so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman, Boaz, with whose young women you've been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes. Now, this is a day when water is pretty scarce. They live in the desert. They don't have waterways coming in. Baths aren't taken very often. Anoint yourself. These are two very poor women at the bottom of society, but yet they have some kind of perfume to put on. It says, "And put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." It's all men. They're drinking after they've worked hard all day. And then they all go out on the floor, and it says, "And when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. And then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, Ruth said to Naomi, "All that you tell me, I will do." It's easy to judge them and say, that doesn't sound too good. But it was the reality of their existence. And so then we can say, well, that's the reality of that existence in those days. I mean, it was pretty dire. But I don't know if any of you have watched the Netflix program called Made. I just happened to watch it. Netflix will suggest programs based on what a person tends to watch. And this one was suggested, and so I thought, well, I tend to do work and kind of listen to it in the evenings, and I thought, well, I'll just kind of watch this. I didn't really know what it was about. I got so enthralled in it and caught up in it that it was very impacting, I guess, and brought up a lot of things in life that I thought about. It's based in Seattle, Washington. Now, I went to Seattle and actually interviewed in Yakima, right out from Seattle, before I came here as your pastor. And so I got to go out there and experience that place for a weekend. It is very different than ours. They have, I don't know how to, they're maybe very, very liberal. So I would say that their rules for the homeless and for taking care of people and for what is legal, what is illegal might be, they early on made marijuana legal. Things like that. I'm not saying right or wrong with that, but I'm just saying that's how out there first they are. But it's based in Seattle, not West Virginia, not Alabama, not Mississippi, not Louisiana. Those who are usually criticized as having drug problems and homeless, etc., etc. We've all heard it. Well, it's a program about domestic violence. Not the extreme, horrible domestic violence that we see on TV sometimes where people are beat, but domestic violence, the anger and the punching the wall rather than, in this case, it was a woman who was had violence against her by I'm not even sure if they were married, but just the violence in a home that there can be without actually physically hurting somebody. That's a little harder to prove. And this program brings out those problems, those things that you and I probably don't even think about in good, stable homes. But people get caught in those things, women in this case. Men do too, but in this case, it was a woman. Well, it also showed the problems with government assistance. We say, well, we've got domestic violence shelters. Well, when they stay there for a while and they try to establish housing, you have to have a job in order to get government-assisted housing. Well, if you are homeless, you don't have a car. The domestic violence centers, our hope here that we support, does have clothing. They can find clothing to go to a job interview. We help with setting up a household, but you have to have a job. Well, if you have a child, you have to have child care. So how do you handle child care? Getting to the job, getting to your child. What happens if your child gets sick? What do? They did this program did a very fascinating, very well done depiction of the struggles of a young woman who really wanted to make it and make it better in life. Well, I was listening to the radio and it began to talk about Andie MacDowell, who is the actress who's the mother in the program, and that her daughter is the one that portrays the daughter in the program. So I began to look it up online, and I should remember, IDMB site, it said that it was a true story. Now, I was already captivated, and I already watched the entire thing, just tied to it. And then to find out, it was written by a memoir. The program was the memoir of a young lady. In our day, in our country, in one of the most liberal states of our country. So I encourage you to look at it. It's easy for us sitting in a warm sanctuary with everything we need to say, oh, come on. It's the choices you make. And the program shows that. It shows bad choices. But then when I thought about it, would I make any better choice? I don't know if I were walking in her shoes. It's easy for us to judge what these women were doing in order to make it. So then, she went to the threshing hole. She did what her mother-in-law said. At midnight, she lay down at his feet. And then he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. Cloak. That's the same word that's used back in chapter 2 in verse 12. That talks about God's wings of protection over. And it's where Naomi is saying, may God's wings protect. But here it's translated cloak, but it's the same idea. That cloak or wings of protection around. So she is asking for protection. And so then in verse 10 it says, Boaz says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. He says, but in essence, you have your kindness toward Naomi, and here it says loyalty, but it's the same word that is also kindness. In chapter 1, Naomi asks for God's kindness to her daughter-in-laws. And then here in verse 2:20, Boaz's actions, the same word, are kindness toward Ruth. And now here it's Ruth, you've been that kind to Naomi. It's the wings of protection in kindness, not just random acts of kindness or just handing someone something. It's that doing more to protect, to take care of. That kind of kindness. God's kindness to us. It's the redemptive way, the merciful way. And so then in verse 16, she goes back to Naomi, 16 to 18, and this begins, actually, our verses for today. And so she goes back to Naomi, and she says, how did things go with you, my daughter? She told her that what the man had done for her, saying, he gave me a lot of barley, a lot of food, and he did not want her to go back empty-handed to Naomi. And then Naomi said, okay, let's wait. Let's see what happens. Because you see, Boaz had the power to redeem her, the ability, but here he also had the willingness to redeem her. And so he went to the gate, which is where all law was taken care of in those days. And he went, there was another man there who was next of kin, and that's where we find out that Naomi had land. And so he said, I would like to redeem Naomi and her land. And he said, but there's another one closer in kinship, and if that man wants to redeem, by law he could, then he can redeem. Well, that man said, yeah, sure, I will. But then there Boaz said, oh, but wait, when you redeem, you also redeem Ruth, the Moabite. You have to take her too. And so we can look at that story and we can think, well, he did not want to. Look how good Boaz is and how bad that guy is. Well, no, we might do a little walking in his shoes too. Was he unwilling to take a Moabite? Yeah, he may have been. It's a pretty big liability. Or maybe he had other children, which is what he says. He says, it'll affect the inheritance of my children. And so he said no. Maybe he couldn't afford it. Yeah, maybe there was land that came with it, but there were also 2 more mouths. We don't know. But for whatever reason, he said no. Again, easy to judge if we don't walk in his shoes. But Boaz had the power to redeem, give life, kindness, mercy, whatever, to these 2 women. That cloak of kindness, of protection. And he also had the willingness to do it. And Naomi's plan was risky, and it was desperate. But despite Ruth and Naomi's impropriety, they were given life, wings of protection, because Boaz was willing to redeem.